Hello, and welcome to tonight's event, Politics and the Common Life, a conversation about faithful political engagement. We're really glad you can make it for this important conversation. My name is Travis Piquel, and I'm the Associate Director of University Engagement here at Anselm House, a Center for Christian Study at the University of Minnesota. I'll be serving as the moderator for tonight's discussion. I invite you all to participate in our program this evening by adding your own questions. You can go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and you'll find a Q&A button there. I invite you to submit your questions for the panelists as we have our discussion, and we'll save some time during the second half of our program tonight for them to answer your questions. I'd like to take a brief moment also to thank all of our co-sponsors. First of all, I'd like to thank the Initiative on Faith and Public Life at the American Enterprise Institute. And we're also being joined by Christian study centers all around the country, including the Center for Christian Study at the University of Virginia, the North Carolina Study Center at UNC Chapel Hill, and Upper House at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'd like to jump right into our program tonight by introducing our panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Justin Giboney. Justin is an attorney and a political strategist from Atlanta, Georgia, and he's the co-founder of the AND campaign. Justin has served as Georgia's 5th Congressional District Delegate for the Democratic National Convention and as the co-chair of Obama for America's Gen 44 Atlanta initiative. Justin, you can go ahead and make yourself known. There you are. Well, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me, Travis. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Next, I'd like to introduce Cherie Harder. Cherie serves as the president of the Trinity Forum. Prior to joining the Trinity Forum in 2008, Ms. Harder served as in the White House as special assistant to the president and director of policy and projects for First Lady Laura Bush. She's also worked on Capitol Hill as policy advisor to Senator Bill Frist and as policy director for Senator Sam Brownback. Cherie, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Travis.
And finally, I'd like to welcome Michael Ware. Michael is the founder of Public Square Strategies, and he's also the chief strategist and member of the executive team for the AND campaign, which he works on with Justin. He formerly served in the White House faith-based initiatives under President Obama. And Michael writes broadly on issues of faith and public life. We're glad you could be with us, Michael.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
Absolutely. So just jumping into our discussion tonight on faithfulness in Christian politics and political engagement, I want to start with a sort of a broader question and invite each of you to answer it, because it's not clear to me that when we talk about politics or political engagement, that everybody means the same thing when they use those words. Some people might think about politics as presidential elections, which certainly we're thinking a lot about these days. They might think about politics as ways to mediate conflict. They might think about politics in other ways. So I'd be just curious to hear from each of you, maybe starting with Justin. When we talk about politics, what is it that we're talking about? What in your view is politics?
Yeah, in the most general sense, politics is really the process and kind of the actions by which we choose our representatives and create policy within the framework of the Constitution. It's how we use our power and influence in the civic space. I think from a very, very practical point of view for Christians, politics should be a robust opportunity to protect human dignity and promote human flourishing. I would be very careful to separate the statecraft from the relationships and from community. I think statecraft should never be completely isolated from relationships with citizens and the community. We have to put, as some have said, skin on policy. Managing the affairs of the state is important, but I think if it's detached from a connection with the grassroots people, then people just become numbers and data. And I think sometimes you see this as a problem kind of with the technocrat, right? Where they might have the resume, they might have an understanding of how government operates, but often are not connected with the people in any significant way. And I think that's bad. So you do have to understand the completely practical side of it, managing the state, but also the interaction with the people, the needs of the people, and making sure that you kind of have that common touch and at least a significant connection to the grassroots as well.
How about you, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think Justin is right. I mean, politics is related to governance, the art and practice of governance, and all kinds of things get implicated there. I did an event earlier this week where I was asked about the saying, everything is political, and I think that there's in some ways that was a helpful corrective to those who wanted to who could not see the ways in which people's lives intersected with political decisions. I think often, though, sort of that phrase, there are problems with how that specific phrase is used, but then sort of on top of that, it's often used in the reverse to say politics is everything, and politics is certainly not everything. And so, politics is is not ultimate. It's a secondary area. It's where we try to seek or where we try to apply the ultimate big ideas into the very sort of prudential area of governance and policy making. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk a bit more about that and what that entails. But yeah, politics brings in a whole lot, but at its core, it's about governance. It's how we govern ourselves.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add to that, Travis, is, at its most basic, and I think both Justin and Michael really teased this out, at its most basic, politics is essentially about how we order our common life together, which is necessary to do, and what ends we order it toward, and what means we use to do that. And of course, how that works itself out. We'll be discussing a lot of that over the next hour.
Yeah, absolutely. So, having put that on the table, politics as ordering our common life together, there are different ways we might think about that as Christians. It strikes me that, we could think about politics as a sort of a creational good or a moral good, something that is worth pursuing in and of itself, or we might think about politics as simply a way of restraining evil, or sort of a necessary evil, which is a different way of thinking about it. Do any of you have any thoughts about how Christians should begin to think about, the realm of politics, and whether it's more of a sort of a realm of moral good or a realm of necessary evil?
Yeah, I think Justin already touched on it. I think politics is not but an essential form in which we can love our neighbor. What's clear is that politics has the ability to either affirm or undermine people's human dignity, has the ability to advance or draw back on the advancement and well-being of people. And so we because it has that capacity, we don't just want it to be sort of neutral. We certainly want to push back on its negative impacts, but we also know that government can be a positive actor. And I mean, that's just that's proven in the lives of people every day. It's not just a neutral good that we have traffic laws and that we're able to prevent cars from going into intersections and crashing into other cars and people. It's a good that order is good, and so I think that's that's a key aspect of this. I'd also say politics. Pope John Paul II referred to it sort of the vocation of politics. And in the United States, politics is, we each hold a political office as citizens. And so thinking about how we steward that office of citizen that we hold, not just in preventing evil, but how can we love our neighbors? To love in Augustinian terms is to seek the good. So how do we seek the good of our neighbors? How do we love our neighbors with the limited political influence we have?
Let me ask a follow-up, which you're already starting to touch on, Michael, but maybe direct this one to Justin and Cherie. I'm sure that within our audience, there's going to be people who are skeptical about the mixing of Christianity and politics, or religion and politics more broadly. Some on the one side will likely feel that to bring Christianity and politics together risks the neutrality of our government, or the neutrality of the state or the public sphere, and sort of would want to press a more strict separation of church and state for reasons of sort of more political reasons. On the other side, there's probably some here who are skeptical about the premise that Christians should be political or participate in politics, because they feel that Christianity itself is apolitical or non-political or spiritual in a way that's that to make it political would be to harm the Christian witness to the transcendence of the Christian message. So there's some skepticism on both sides. How would you sort of reply to people on one or the other side who might be skeptical about bringing faith and politics together?
I can take it unless Cherie wants to go. Well, for the first group, I would say that you cannot, the separation between church and state is one of the most misunderstood concepts I think that there is. You cannot separate our kind of government from the values of the people. There's no way to do it. When people vote, they're voting their values. When we create laws, we're creating laws based on some type of value. Now that doesn't mean we should establish any one particular church, but people cannot separate what they believe from the choices that they make within the political space. The second thing that I would say is that, I'd suggest that anyone who questions if our faith has practical implications and a social application should really read through the Old Testament prophets and see how they talked about impartiality in our societal interactions, how they talked about the treatment of the poor by rulers. If you go through Amos, if you go through Isaiah, when they were threatening to, when God threatened Israel at times and others, it was based on how the poor were being treated sometimes. It was based on partiality in the courts. I would say that people should reread James and 1 John 3 and see how they wrote about the importance of not just our words, but our deeds in loving someone. It's not just what you say to them, but if you have something that they might need, it's about being self-sacrificial. And so I think there's certainly a social application, and the gospel has political implications. But I think I understand why people are a little bit skeptical. I think we should be vigilant. We should make sure that politics don't become ultimate, as Michael mentioned earlier, but certainly our God and what we believe has something to say within the political arena.
Sherry, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, really, I just sort of like to double click on what Justin just said. I think that's spot on. There's a huge, as he said, there's a lot of misunderstanding around what the separation of church and state means. And there's a huge difference between prohibiting the church from having ecclesial authority in the public square and trying to banish or outlaw bringing our faith to practical considerations. Anytime you are engaging in politics, that is engaging in the ordering of society together, you cannot help but bring your deepest values to that discussion. And saying that faith should not be part of that discussion is not neutrality at all, but really a form of tyranny that strips what is primary from considerations of the public good.
So I want to ask a question about our political culture more broadly, which, many people here may be feeling, as I've heard other people say, that, talking about politics is, if anything, it's sort of wearying because of how much conflict there seems to be in the nature of the conflict, in particular, the political conflict that we're seeing in our nation today. Political conflict obviously is not something new in our history. It's been part of our sort of democratic ethos from the beginning. But some might be asking questions about, is the nature of our political conflict and disagreement and polarization, is it changing somehow? Scholars have talked a little bit about this idea of affective polarization, which I'll just read a short definition here, is the idea that when we encounter somebody who disagrees with us, we're no longer viewing them as individuals who are simply wrong or mistaken, but instead we're viewing them as somebody who's evil or immoral. So there's this sort of layer to our polarization. Do you agree that somehow, the nature of our polarization is changing or taking on this affective element? And if so, what do you think is driving that phenomenon? Sherry, will you start?
I sure will. There is a lot of evidence to suggest exactly that. As you can imagine, lots of polls and lots of studies on this. And most of them are pretty much in agreement that, essentially some recent polls, one done by Pew, found that, essentially it was like right around 80% of Republicans and around the same for Democrats viewed the other side very unfavorably, which is actually up like at least it's like a tripling of that kind of unfavorability from just a generation ago. I saw another poll, and I'm forgetting where it was from, but it was kind of horrifying, that found that 20% of Democrats and 15% of Republicans thought the country would be better off if large portions of the other side just died. That is not a normal or a healthy response to, our shared venture of living together in a democratic country. And you kind of unpacking the reasons for that, that could actually take us all night, but I will toss out just a few. One, I think undeniably social media has played a role in that we are increasingly having our sort of information streams siloed, increasingly sort of ideologically polarized. There's a whole phenomenon where when you are in a group of people of relatively like mind, the consensus skews towards the most extreme version of that consensus. So in many ways, the way we get our information is almost tailor-made to kind of skew us towards, fear, loathing, disapproval of the other side. Our use of language really doesn't help that. One is rewarded on social media for essentially being quick, snarky, and nasty, all of which are ways that are kind of oppositional to civility, reflection, thoughtfulness. When one is attacked in an ad hominem way, rarely is one inclined to be gracious in return. One would hope that would be the case, but that's not just how most people operate. Most of us operate. So the nastiness of the language has a real snowball effect. And I think that's also related to the fact that a lot of us are increasingly, and perhaps distressingly, having too much of our personal identity wrapped up in our ideological positions. And even as the parties get more polarized, there's not necessarily ideological coherence. My background is in Republican politics. When I worked for George W. Bush, free trade was an important part of kind of conservative principles. That has changed rather suddenly recently. But so there's ideological coherence, but there's more of a sense of somehow my personal identity is being attacked or criticized. And I think a lot of us are more likely to react angrily or less than civilly when we feel like our pride is pricked than even when our ideals are assaulted.
I just add, it's important for folks to understand, one sort of top level reason why our politics is so polarized and partisan identity is sort of looming much larger in individual sort of psychological frame of mind, is because that's what's easiest for the political parties. If political parties can get you to treat them as a brand, as an identity marker, rather than what they're actually supposed to be for, which is a vehicle that helps mediate different points of view. Like that's what political parties are for. They're actually built to mediate difference. But it's much easier for political parties to maintain control if they say, oh, well, what it means to be a real Democrat, what it means to be a real Republican is to hold to whatever we tell you every 4 years you're supposed to hold to. Our politics would be so much more healthy if folks started to sort of take on for themselves this idea that you don't believe things because you belong to a political party. You belong to a party in order to implement and try to advance the things that you already believe. But for too many people, political parties are shaping what they believe in actually a pretty like liquid and trivial way. I mean, the clearest example of this that I can think of is right now is the topic of immigration reform, and the fact that when George W. Bush was in office and pushing comprehensive immigration reform, or something like the DREAM Act near the end of his second term, both Republican senators and Republican individuals supported that legislation and the idea of comprehensive immigration reform, a majority. Now, there was still dissension, but a majority. The same legislation was proposed under a Democratic Congress during President Obama's time in office, and Republicans who voted for it no longer supported the same legislation, and the numbers flipped because it was a Democratic president supporting something. Republicans in general opposed it. We see that on both sides all the time. Donald Trump could be saying the sky is blue, and Democrats out of party loyalty would say, oh, I don't know about that. And that's a real problem if we're going to have a shared project of self-governance.
Yeah, I would just add that it's interesting because it seems the party loyalty is almost based on the opposite party rather than the party they're being loyal to. So a lot of what we see is very opposition centered, right? And so as long as the parties can demonize the other side, they don't really have to please you. They just have to make sure that you understand how bad and evil the folks on the other side are. I mean, it's interesting to me that you could have folks in Alabama who've had, Republicans run everything around them. Still, when they talk about politics, will be so angry at Democrats. Or you could go to Chicago, where Democrats have run things for a long time in that city and in the state. And for some reason, Democrats can just be mad at Republicans about what's going on in their city and around and in their communities. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense until we realize that we have a very opposition-centered politics, which is never a good thing.
Yeah, it reminds me of back in the early '90s, sociologist James Davison Hunter wrote a book called The Culture Wars, which sort of launched that term into the political mainstream. But his basic sort of observation was that conservatives from different sort of faith traditions, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, were beginning to align in new ways over against progressives in those very same traditions, such that the traditions don't define you so much as your sort of left-right axis. And he sort of described it as a battle to define America. I was curious to hear whether, are we locked in a culture war that sort of takes that shape? Or is there another way that Christians should think about it? Should Christians be thinking about winning the culture war, avoiding the culture war, or something else altogether?
Yeah, I just quickly say I think what is true and what Hunter sort of tapped into, but it's gotten so much more profound since he wrote that book, is that politics is increasingly a reservoir for all of our resentments and sort of desires and aspirations and forms of self-expression, and our loves and our hatreds. And politics is becoming a forum where we sort of fight about all of it. When that's not the proper, politics is not the proper sort of venue for that. And so in that sense, I do think politics has become a place where you do take out your resentment and try and seek, as Justin points out quite regularly, seek validation in the political realm in a way that's not just unhealthy, but I'm of the point of view that there really is a limited sort of limited amount of attention our politics can take. And if people are bringing all of this cultural baggage, all of these sort of extra political cultural desires to our politics, what that means is that our politics know that space is taken up that could be oriented toward questions about the vulnerable in our society, questions about the discrete purposes of politics and governance. I mean, watch the debate tonight. Watch the debate that took place last week. It's striking how little of our political discourse is actually about governance. It's profoundly striking, and it's because politicians are responding to a set of incentives from voters who unfortunately aren't always going to politics and to politicians for politics.
Mm-hmm. Just to add on to that, I so agree with that. I think we have increasingly freighted politics with far more than it can bear. Mm-hmm. And we expect the practice of politics to, we engage in it to fight battles that don't belong to that realm, and to settle feuds that should be abandoned. And the irony is, as a result, often our politics fails to do the things that actually are within its realm. And when was the last time Congress actually passed a budget? Just the very basics of governance often tend to get neglected because we are asking our politics to do things that it was never intended to do, and actually harms, I think, not only our political system, but even our formation as citizens when we ask it to do it.
Yeah, I would just add quickly that I think the Christian response should be obviously not to make this worse or to join in, but really to be challenging our tribes and challenging our parties to do better and trying to find common ground, not just retweeting the quick-witted, vitriol that we might see that may score some points internally, but making sure that we're holding people accountable and making sure that we're being, because one thing you don't see, and I think someone mentioned it earlier, you just don't see any level of consistency. It's whatever you got to say at the moment to make your side look faultless. And that's just not the way that that's just not a way that a democracy can be healthy if we continue down that
road. I want to remind our participants and our viewers that they can submit their questions. So we have a few more questions and more time to talk with Justin, Cherie, and Michael, but everybody can go ahead and add their questions to the mix as well. That'd be really great. I want to draw attention to something that I noticed in Justin and Michael, the recent book that you all co-authored with a third author about political engagement as Christians. I noticed that there are two adjacent chapters in the book. One deals with civility and the other deals with advocacy and protest. And it strikes me that those are, in many ways, for many Christians around the country, two sort of, calling cards or, calls to action right now in our moment. There are those who say we need more civility. We've lost that in our political discourse, so we need to regain it. And then there are those who are saying we need better advocacy and we need to protest. And in your book, you say you can do both. Now, I know some Christians who would say, well, civility, really what's being asked for in those moments is a defense of the status quo. Civility is a lot easier for those who already hold power. But you're saying, well, actually, no, civility and protest or advocacy are both necessary. Can we have them together, though? Is it possible, and what does it look like?
Yeah, I think we absolutely can have them and must have them together. They are not mutually exclusive. Part of the problem is I think people have used civility, the term, to kind of get people to be docile, to not say anything, to be passive. And I don't think civility is necessarily about being passive. I think you can be very passionate. I think you can be determined. I think you can do a lot of things. And we saw this in the civil rights movement. I mean, this isn't something that I made up, you could see as one of the key guiding principles of the civil rights movement was civility. But it didn't mean that you made everything nice and pleasant for whoever your political opposition might have been at the moment. It meant that you could be passionate. It meant that you could be civilly disobedient, but that there was a line to be drawn. And I think that's some of the folks who advocate for the protest don't want to draw those lines because they don't necessarily want to keep things within the lines of kind of discipline. It's kind of any means necessary. And so those definitions matter. And I think we need a better discussion of what those definitions are, because those two things are not at odds. And I think even statistics show that when you put those two things together, when you have a peaceful protest, it can be very effective. And we need to be able to articulate that so people see it.
Sharia, I wonder if, oftentimes advocacy and protests, at least right now, might be associated with, the political left. I'm curious, in your time on Capitol Hill and in the White House, if you saw, both civility and advocacy going together and what that looked like on the sort of the more political right.
Oh, sure. One area where I think you saw civility and advocacy go together in a really creative and unique way actually had to do with PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief in Africa, which was an extraordinary undertaking and involved changing the minds of a lot of people. So it was really kind of advocacy within the Republican Party, with some Republicans essentially advocating for this and persuading others. And it was, I think, one of the most important achievements of the Bush administration. A more historical example, Martin Luther King Jr., he, a letter from Birmingham jail, he was very pointed in his criticism of the white moderate, and he pulls no punches. At the same time, as forceful as his language is, as pointed as his argument is, he never engages in an ad hominem attack. He makes his case clearly, incredibly persuasively. And he also appeals in many ways to shared authorities. He appeals to Aquinas and Niebuhr and Augustine and Bunyan and others in an attempt to both convict and persuade. And so often when we engage in what is truly incivility, the ad hominem attack, the unfair argument, the insult, the snark, that doesn't persuade anyone. It only kind of hardens our line. So I don't think civility and advocacy are opposed at all. In fact, I think not squishiness, but civility is part of effective advocacy and persuasion.
Yeah, something I've asked at events when I'm speaking about civility, when I've spoken about civility, is this line, Travis, that you mentioned is common. That sort of civility is what the powerful use. I just ask people, when you think of incivility, who comes to mind? The vulnerable and the voiceless? Is that really who comes to mind when you think of incivility? No, it's incivility that is the weapon of those with power. It's incivility. Civility, what's the root of that? It's civics. Civility actually provides the on-ramps to for folks to be heard. At its best, civility allows people to be heard no matter what their station. And so, I just think that's it's really important. I speak of civility as a kind of public grace, the way that in public we recognize the dignity of people that we do not know personally. And incivility at its worst amounts to a public hatred, a public wishing of ill of people you do not know.
So maybe time for one more question here before we go to the audience Q&A. we've touched on issues of power, in our conversation, and I think it was Justin, you mentioned earlier on in your definition of politics as it's a way of negotiating the power that we have. Now there's another quote about power, which is, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's sort of tied into a lot of people's understanding of politics and weariness toward it, that participation in politics can be a sort of degrading or detrimental to spiritual formation. It can be bad for your soul. But I'm curious, given all of your experience over the years, whether you've seen politics function in the opposite direction as well. Can politics be a means of spiritual or moral growth? Is this something that you've experienced or seen? Michael, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I remember I was doing an event in New York, and someone came up to me and said, at a church, and afterwards someone came up to me and said, I can't believe you did it, that you were in that world of politics with all of its compromise and all of its ethical dilemmas. I'm glad you're out of there, basically. Like, it seems like you held up, but I'm glad you didn't. I'm glad you sort of weren't in government forever. And got in the conversation, and I asked the person, what do you do? And they said, oh, I work on Wall Street. And that just really, this idea that politics is this uniquely corrupting. There are unique aspects to politics, but this idea that politics is this singularly sort of dark sort of realm. No, the questions in politics are the questions that we face in all kinds of areas of our life. It's questions of faithfulness, of stewardship, of what the orientation of our heart is. And my concern is, when folks seek to sort of extract themselves from questions of faithfulness in politics, first of all, that's a decision in itself. Again, in this country, you do not choose to have political influence. By virtue of being a citizen, you already have it. The question is what you do with it. And so there is no sort of way to avoid political questions in this country. And then, secondly, I just say, public life, political life, like every other area of life, is a forum for spiritual formation, that you can actually learn to treat people. I hope we get into this in the questions. We ought to be thinking about how the fruit of the Spirit applies to politics. And too often Christians throw that like that's a personal, private thing. How silly to think that we can display gentleness and self-control in no, that's exactly what Jesus is calling us to, and it's exactly what our politics needs.
Travis, if I can jump in, I'll just add, one of our readings at the Trinity Forum is called The Spiritual Growth of a Public Man, and it's about Abraham Lincoln and how his own experience in office was a really important part of his spiritual formation. Now, of course, Lincoln suffered greatly in office. He, was the president and shouldered responsibility during perhaps, the most difficult time the country ever went through. And I think part of it too is, again, what orients our participation in politics? What are the ends that we work towards? And if your end is power, there is something that is corrupting about that. If it's only about winning and power, it's clear biblically. There's a lot of literature that reflects that too. Lord of the Rings, comes to mind. There is something inherently deformational about that. If your end is to seek the good of your neighbor and the good and the shalom of the community, you will have challenges, but that's not a deformational practice. That's a formational practice. And so much of it depends on what we are oriented towards in the practice of politics.
Yeah, I would just add that, well, first, I agree with all that was said. I think that's spot on. I would just add that when we're worried about what power can do to us. I think that's in a lot of ways where institutions come into play, and where we have to have institutions to be able to hold people accountable. I think Yuval Levin's book, Time to Build, talks about that in a really good way, and I suggest that people read it. We got to have those institutions to keep, and kind of those mechanisms to keep all of us, ourselves and others included, from going into a different position. And I think people can grow, and I think that you do see spiritual growth within civics, but I would try not to center the politics of it, right? Politics is a tool or a means towards doing something else. At that point, you can see growth. But when it becomes the, I guess the goal or the objective within itself, then I think you would run into problems.
Justin, I'm really glad you brought up institutions. And Dean, one of our attendees, has asked about that precisely. She asks, what kind of institutions do you think are best positioned to constrain the worst excesses of our current politics? And conversely, what type of institutions may be able to incentivize a more productive governance? Anybody have thoughts on where other institutions can come in and sort of aid our political life?
A couple. I think the local church has a role to play. I think obviously when it comes to Christians, there ought to be ways of responsible accountability for the ways that people act in public, and both setting an example and just being clear that politics is not sort of this one area that's cordoned off from God, in which you sort of can treat people in ways that you would never think of treating if they were down the pew from you at church, or if they were sort of in your local sort of life. And then I'd say, I think we do ourselves a disservice when we think of politics as an individualistic endeavor. And Justin's absolutely right about sort of the role institutions can play. One of the roles institutions can play is they take off the burden of individuals feeling like they need to sort of force their way into sort of being heard. Instead, they can join with an institution that has a mandate to reflect their point of view on a particular issue or cause. And that sort of diffuses some of the identitarian stuff we could see, and some of the sort of personal animosity we could see, and channels it through civic institutions, through institutions that are designed to sort of advocate for the public good as they see it.
That's great. We have a question here about the tension between sort of passion for political causes and the challenge of dialogue. Given that there are certain subjects that we care very deeply about, people might list abortion, immigration, social justice. How is it that we can have dialogue? Or, can you be absolutely passionate about particular subjects or policies and still hold generosity toward those who disagree?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we have to. And the sad thing is, sometimes when people think of an issue, they think of the advocates. And sometimes the advocates are the worst people to think of, because they don't conduct themselves in a way that does justice to the people that they say they're advocating for. We have to remember, and I think Sheree said it earlier, incivility and spewing vitriol is just not effective. You don't convince anyone, you don't persuade anyone, and persuasion within a democracy is so important. And so if you want to persuade people, you should discipline your tongue. I mean, we know the Bible talks about that all the time, to go out with discipline. And I'm not talking about respectability or any of those things. I don't think it's a matter of education. I think it's a matter of setting certain standards for yourself and representing the people you say you're advocating for in a way that gives them a chance to get what they need. And too often we let ourselves get taken away by things that just are not helping us get closer to the goal.
It's really great. Sheree or Michael, do you want to add to that?
I think Justin said it quite well.
Great. Here's an interesting question from Marin. We've talked a little bit about political parties and the challenges of being a part of them. she asks whether any of the panelists think that an emergence of a third party is plausible or, more importantly, needed. And her question just went away. I will find it. Oh no, it's gone. But anyway, so I'll just sort of finish it out in my own gloss of it, which is, how does that also relate to those who would say, because of the difficulty of being a part of either party today as a Christian, we should just abscond from party politics as much as possible?
Yeah, I've said before, the crisis is not that we're politically homeless, but that we ever thought we could find a home in politics at all. And the idea there is kind of what C.S. Lewis was talking about. He has this little known essay, Meditations on the Third Commandment, where he contemplates whether there should be a Christian political party in the UK. And he says something in the essay, and I'm paraphrasing here. He says, first, the temptation when we combine faith and politics is to proclaim that God hath said when he has not spoken at all. There's a temptation to sort of conflate political positions with religious dogma itself. And, I think there's a structural question about whether a third party might help upset the effective polarization we're seeing, the sort of stalemate we're seeing in Congress. And those are all structural questions we could think about. I'm really interested right now in the question of multi-party districts that Lee Drutman is advancing. And we could look at campaign finance reform. There are all kinds of things that we could talk about that would make our political system healthier. What I do want to push back on is this idea that we sort of could create a political party that sort of gets everything right, and we could all just sort of belong to that party and there'd be no tension in politics. We need to be really wary of this idea that there's sort of the Christian position on an issue. Instead, we have the freedom, and because politics is a prudential area, that yes, we want people to be faithful, but we don't put a stamp on what rate at which capital gain should be taxed. There is no one Christian answer to that question, and we should be really, really hesitant about pointing that out. Just one last thing I'd say, I do think there's a general tension, which the ANN campaign gets at too, which is this sort of false dichotomy that our two-party system offers between, in Ann's language, compassion and conviction, social justice and moral order. And I just say that the two-party system our parties have not been stagnant on those questions. I'm someone who thinks that there's ability to reform within this two-party system, though we may be in a period of such disruption that, unlike most of our political history, a third party is a viable option. But I'm not looking to the emergence of a third party as sort of the answer. Yeah.
I just add, Travis, like starting a third party is also, just practically speaking, very, very difficult to do. There were people who tried to do that in the 2016 election, very smart people with a lot of funding. It didn't work. That's not to say it can't work at some point, but just a dose of reality. It's not easy to do. And just to pick up on something that both Michael said and that Justin had alluded to earlier, I do think, as Michael was saying, sometimes there is an inflated expectation that parties should be like vehicles for self-expression, and reflect to a fairly extraordinary extent the sum of our political and philosophical convictions. And parties, back to Justin's point about institutions, at one point were institutions that did enforce a particular discipline. And one of the things we are seeing happen now is actually members of government trying to use their position as their own personal platform, rather than essentially kind of disciplining themselves to carry out the responsibilities that are inherent in the institution they belong to. So you have senators who, I won't name names, but who leave hearings immediately to go tweet and record podcast on what just transpired. You see a lot of different members of Congress and the Senate and other branches of government, use social media to essentially comment on what is going on, rather than the discipline within that party to essentially curtail some of the that self-expression. So I think you've seen a real shift recently, and the idea that our party should perfectly reflect our philosophical convictions is relatively new, and one that I think anyone who believes that is doomed to disappointment.
Yeah, we've always had a two-party system in this country. It's a very heavy lift, as the other two have just mentioned. I would say I would love to see a third party just to mix things up. That would be great. But I would tell people this: usually when people are asking for one, and I think the other two hitting on this a little bit, they're asking for something that they can relate to and embrace even more so. And I think one of the cures for that, so you don't feel like a third party is so necessary that you can't participate unless you have it, is making sure that you understand that it's not part of your identity anyway. That there's a separation, that just because I vote for Democrats or I'm a registered Democrat does not mean that everything they do is a reflection on me, especially if I'm vocally going against some of the things they do, because I feel a responsibility because of that association to do that. So don't feel like because you vote, primarily, or you register for one or the other, that everything that they do is on you. It's not. You should feel like you should speak out against those things, but hopefully you can rest a little easier, or you can be in a party a little more easily if you don't feel the pressure to have that as part of your identity, and then thinking that everything that they do is kind of on your back. That's not the truth.
That's great. One question that I think is really interesting is this. One of our attendees that says, given that we all agree, or granted that we all agree that the correct orientation of politics is to serve our neighbors and bring peace to our community, what about perhaps the problem is that people disagree about what's best for the community, and that disagreement is what's sort of dividing the community. What then? So I suppose the question is about, what are our avenues for substantively discussing the good of the community and making progress toward some sort of shared vision? Is that sort of possible in our day?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is possible. One of the things we have to do, and I mentioned this earlier, is try to find common ground. If we're just talking past each other, if we see reality two different ways, then we're going to be in trouble. And so we have to push intellectual honesty on both sides of the aisle. We cannot try to just maintain these ironclad and often fictitious narratives that really are pulling us so far apart that we can't have a real discussion, and we can't have a discourse that's going to be productive. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we're looking for common ground, that we're going into those conversations with humility, but also asking our side to be honest. And sometimes being honest in those situations means that you may not be arguing on behalf of your immediate interest when you're more interested in kind of healing the dialogue.
Great. Let me just sort of point the question a little bit more to ask whether you've seen particular sort of avenues or institutions or spheres of life in which those kinds of discussions can be had better than others. So we talked about social media earlier as perhaps maybe a place where it doesn't, it's not likely to happen, but are there others where it may be more likely to happen?
Well,
I think it happens on a local, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think we were going to say the same thing, actually. I was going to say you need to look at the local level, because at the local level, every day and in every way, there are people who disagree about what's best for the community. But they're in that community and they have to work it out. Yeah. And so they do that. And that is the messy, gritty work of council meetings, and even as a small community as HOA board meetings and the like, where people with very different views of the community have to meet face to face and figure it out. So you do see it happen. What's lacking there is those folks aren't able to avoid any actual contact with the person they disagree with. And in the privacy of their own home, essentially smear their reputation and kind of have other people reinforce that and feel more and more secure in their position with it never being challenged. So I think when you actually have to engage with people who disagree with you and a decision has to be made, it forces a certain practical wrestling with how do we find a way forward, even though we have a big disagreement on what's best for the community in this particular situation.
Great. Yeah, I just add, and there's a whole debate that's ongoing right now about sort of the epistemological implications of having a system set up like we do as a liberal democracy. But as a liberal democracy, competing visions of the good is exactly what politics is for. And so, within the confines of this system, and we could have all kinds of interesting conversations about sort of how that sets people up to think about God and ultimate reality and those kinds of things. But within the system of government we have, those are the kind of debates I think we could use more of. We could use more debates about how people want to advance and how people think the community is best served. It's not those kinds of and I think often we could there are people who sort of conflate those kinds of disagreements, and as we spoke to earlier, say that if you really believe in your vision of the good, then civility, treating your opponents with dignity, has to go out the window, because then you're sort of making concessions. You're sort of not willing to really go after it. And that's we need to dismiss that out of hand. This idea that if you really care about your vision of the good, you'll sort of take a no holds barred approach.
So Dan asks, which Christian thinker has shaped your thinking the most in the area of public theology or politics? Michael, you want to start?
Yeah, I'm laughing because everyone on this call, I think, knows what my answer is going to be. Dallas Willard has been really influential in my life. He is, and I could go on, but I'll just point. There are two books in particular: Knowing Christ Today. Well, actually three. Knowing Christ Today, The Allure of Gentleness, which is sort of ostensibly about Christian apologetics, but I read it as sort of a resource for how Christians should be in public generally. And then his book, Divine Conspiracy, have been really meaningful to me. And then another person who we talk about quite a bit in the last chapter of Compassion and Conviction, Howard Thurman, has meant a great deal to me as well, especially Jesus and the Disinherited, and the way that he walks through what our faith offers to those who have their backs up against the wall, as he writes.
How about you, Justin?
Yeah, I would say, if I had to give two, I would say Dr. Martin Luther King, Community of Chaos, the way that he looked at engaging society through a Christian lens really has had a huge impact on how I go about advocacy. And then also G.K. Chesterton. I think orthodoxy, which isn't just about politics, but it speaks so much to really, it applies to the moment that we're going through right now, and how true Christian values and that compassion and conviction can speak into this moment.
I'll just add, these aren't always thinkers, but just some examples of statesmen who have done this, because it's always nice to sort of see what does it look like in action. And of course, none of these people were perfect. They made mistakes. They were wrong about things. They did things very worthy of criticism. But Nelson Mandela's example of after 27 years of imprisonment, being able to essentially prevent civil war and unite a deeply divided nation through essentially the extension of, he sought both forgiveness and justice, and it was remarkable. You know, in many ways, there are things you could certainly criticize Abraham Lincoln for, but you know, someone who both his words, the way he even spoke, encouraged people to think in a different way, and made possible the envisioning of grace and forgiveness, while he didn't waver at all in his efforts to win a civil war. Václav Havel is someone whose example I think is fascinating. This was, you know, a dissident who was imprisoned, becomes president, takes some time off to go and reflect. I mean, like, how countercultural is that? And argues very specifically for civility, even though he pursued a very pointed and in many ways radical agenda, and talked about how you know, the only way to pursue freedom and justice and decency and you know, a humane social order is justly and decently and humanely. You know, the means need to reflect the ends, or that they will distort them. So those examples at times have been helpful to me, just in that you know, at times it's hard to, like, well, it's one thing in theory, it's another thing in practice. Who actually embodied it?
Great. So we've talked a little bit about the media and social media. Michael mentioned the epistemological crisis of our time. You know, Helen has asked, in essence, how do you get out of the echo chamber? Is there any advice for those of us who are watching on how to do that?
It takes real intention. And so it takes both a proactive sort of plan for how to do that, and then it takes assessment of how you're doing in that. And so, you know, I will regularly check my Twitter feed and my Facebook wall. And if I look back and find that, you know, 19 out of my last 20 political posts were affirming my sort of political tribe and sort of rejecting or sort of critiquing those outside of my my political tribe, that's a check for me. That's a yellow, that's a caution light for me. I try and share points of view that contest my own. So, for instance, there was Alec McGillis, who's a journalist, wrote an essay about school closings and the way that public school closings affect during COVID have affected poor communities. I had been generally of the mind that that we shouldn't be exposing communities to health outbreak, and I was really challenged by the evidence that he put out. And I'd shared my point of view on that subject earlier, and I shared Alec's article and said, you know, this is really challenging me. And then just the other thing is just trying to. I don't want folks to feel a burden for, like, oh, I got to read 3 hours of news every day. Just with the time that you have, whatever that is, whatever your season of life, try and make sure that you're reading from legitimate but varied sources of information. So for a perspective that is typically more progressive, more left-leaning than mine, I read the Boston Review, and I get a lot of sort of challenging ideas from that. For a perspective that's usually more to the right of mine, I'll read the National Review or Yuval Levin's work. then I'll typically read the Atlantic and a few other publications as well. But trying to make sure that you're hearing from, if you haven't read something in the last 2 weeks that challenges your point of view on a political subject, you're probably not reading widely enough.
I just add too that college and university should be an abundance of riches when it comes to that. My college experience for the last 3 years, one of my roommates was the president of Campus Crusade, and the other was the president of the Harvard Civil Liberties Union. And that experience actually, I think, was one of the more important parts of my education. And the gal who was the president of the Civil Liberties Union was absolutely brilliant. We didn't agree on a lot, but we loved each other as friends. And I think we both had a curiosity about why we thought what we did, and sort of discovered that she had very good reasons for thinking what she did. Even if I didn't agree with where she wound up, she had good reasons for doing so. And that's a discovery and an education in and of itself. And there are all sorts of folks who wildly disagree with one that are probably living within 100 yards of you when you're in college. So it should be a target-rich environment for those kind of discussions.
Strikes me that is an opportunity to ask them where they are, learning about their news, and ask, finding ways to share with friends who aren't necessarily being mediated through social media algorithms, but maybe also that way as well. We do have a question also about how churches should relate to politics and the political sphere. Given that we have a separation of church and state, which means that there's no sort of institutionalized national church, no established national church. There's this question about how the institutions of the church, denominations or congregations, rather than simply individual Christians, how these sort of organizations and institutions should relate to politics. Is there a special role for churches as collective bodies or institutions in our politics?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that the church can do. Obviously, that we don't believe the church should be necessarily endorsing or anything like that, right? But as far as providing perspective, where should politics play in our life? How much of our life should be given to it, and how the gospel may have political implications, but where that begins and where it stops, and kind of where to align that with our life, I think is very important. And then churches coming together, one of the things the AND campaign says all the time, we talk about it in the book, coming together to make sure that Christians are informed, to raise civic literacy, to have faith in politics forums where people are just getting out information, not where you're necessarily, again, endorsing anyone, but just giving the community a chance to hear what their politicians or what the people in different offices have to say.
Jerry or Michael, would you like to add to that about the political role of the church?
I just quickly add that I think there's wide range here for various approaches. Different denominations, different cultures have a different sort of level of tolerance and history of engaging politics in the church context, and I think that's generally okay. I mean, I think I have some sort of guardrails, but within those guardrails, there's room for a wide range of various sort of forms of activity and approaches. I will say one thing I've been urging pastors to be careful about is you just have to, and I know pastors are getting hounded sometimes with sort of requests to speak to this issue or that issue, and usually it's sort of in the very moment, a crisis moment. There's a vote on this, next week you have to speak to this, don't you care, kind of thing. And I think depending on the issue, the context, there might be a reason to speak to specific political issues of the day. Actually, I think there are good reasons to speak to political issues of the day from the pulpit. You want to be really careful about using the same authority that you use to read from the Gospels and the same position from the pulpit to proclaim political views which are prudential and debatable and which there could be decent Christian disagreement about. Not only because there's a form of manipulation that involves in favor of your political views, but over time what that does is it confuses congregants about, well, if there are political pronouncements being made from the pulpit on, again, like passing temporal things, what you think, how you think a certain debate should end up. If the pastor is sort of speaking about those issues on Sunday morning, maybe we can't take him seriously when he gives core scriptural truths. There's a real manipulation of authority that goes on that just pastors in particular need to be careful about and thoughtful about.
Very, very helpful. We have time for one more question. Michael, you've spoken a couple times about the fruit of the Spirit. At Anselm House, we also sometimes talk about the virtues when we talk with our students. I wonder if you were pressed, if you could name one political virtue that's needed the most in our time. Faith, hope, love, patience, hospitality, justice, there are many more, or fruit of the Spirit, Michael. Which one would you choose, and what practices could we adopt now that could help us foster the cultivation of that virtue?
Yeah, this hope, but not, it's really important. Often hope is spoken about in our politics right now as sort of something that you need to manufacture, or else what purpose would you have fighting on a certain issue or cause? That's not the kind of hope I'm speaking about. I'm talking about a hope that is grounded in ultimate truth and real security, that from that ground of a solid hope in Jesus, you're then able to hope for a whole range of possibilities in politics and in other areas. It's that security, it's that sense of horizon that is often missing from our politics right now. We, as Christians, we need to lift up the lid a little bit on our pressurized, sort of closed-in political environment.
To hope, I would just add love. I mean, of course, we need them all. Politics should aim at justice. We desperately need hope. Greatest of these is love. And one of the things we desperately need is to love our neighbor, to want their good. We've been seeing what happens when that ceases to be the case on a mass level. It is hard to actively will to will evil towards another while you're praying for them. And it doesn't mean that you agree with them. It doesn't mean you think they're right. It doesn't mean that you don't think that there are very destructive consequences to some of the views that they hold. But one can still, pray for our neighbors and pray for the community. And that, I think, is one of the best ways to help form our capacity for love.
Yeah, I would say moral imagination is something I've been talking about quite a bit, which is, to me, the ability not just to see what has been historically or what is at the present, but what actually could be. I think it prevents us from being a slave to the moment, prevents us from not being able to see past the election, prevents us from being opposition centered or just seeing our opposition in their worst moments and then losing sight of their human dignity. And I think that's really something that's missing right now in our politics.
Lovely. Well, thank you all for a really rich and wonderful discussion. I also want to thank everybody who's joined us tonight, all the attendees, and also our co-sponsors, the American Enterprise Institute and the Initiative on Faith and Public Life, the UNC Study Center, the Christian Study Center at the University of Virginia, Upper House, at UW-Madison, and of course, Anselm House here. We're really grateful to have this conversation. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Cherie, and thank you, Michael.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks.
God bless.